Hi, I'm Matt Shepard.
And I'm Chad Shepard.
Today on Shep, Shower, and Shave, we discuss the biggest issue facing the Tigers. It's not what you may have originally thought, and why the Lions' Calvin Johnson situation isn't as bad as the media is making it out to be. That's coming up. Today on Shep, Shower, and Shave, we discuss the biggest issue facing the Tigers. It's not what you may have originally thought, and why the Lions' Calvin Johnson situation really isn't as bad as the media is making out to be. Glad you're with us. Alongside Chad Shepard, I'm Matt Shepard. Glad you're with us. The Tigers, at this time of our broadcast, even 500. They lose the weekend series to Texas. Texas clearly the better team in the three-game series. But Detroit's a team right now, Chad, I think, that is struggling in a way that not many of us expected. We all thought it was going to be the bullpen. And sure, it has been the bullpen at times. But right now, I'm more concerned about the starting pitching than anything else. Let me give you a couple of reasons. Matt Boyd, Daniel Norris, Jordan Zimmerman. I know Francisco Rodriguez is of major concern, Anibal Sanchez as well. But those three guys, those three starting pitchers, to me, are bigger concerns than the two flailing arms in the bullpen, because I am counting on those three guys to make their starts. I can avoid, more oftentimes than not, I can avoid Francisco Rodriguez. I can avoid Anibal Sanchez. I cannot get past Matt Boyd, Jordan Zimmerman, and Daniel Norris starting. In order for this team to have any success, those three guys have to turn it around, and we'll get into their numbers a little bit.
And they got to instill a little bit of confidence in their teammates and in themselves, because you want to approach the game each day like you have a chance to win. And sometimes it feels like you've lost before you've even gone out there when you have guys that are in a funk the way that some of these guys are. Now, despite some of the numbers you talked about, the Tigers are second in the AL in quality starts from their starting pitchers with 23.
Okay, a lot of that is because of Michael Fulmer.
No, understood. But they've also given up the third most walks and the fourth most home runs in the AL. That's where you can put yourself into a hole early in games, and the Tigers' offense can be streaky at times. And when that's the case, you can't always catch up to those early deficits.
Who of those three guys, Boyd, Norris, and Zimmerman, have you lost the most faith in?
That's a difficult question. I think lost the most faith in probably Zimmerman from where he fell to.
Right.
Norris and Boyd did not quite raise the bar so high last year. They were overachieving so much in the 2016 season that everything they did was gravy on top. It was great.
Yeah.
And now when you have different expectations for them, you begin to question: did I have expectations that were within, out of their reach of possibility, or is that on them for not progressing the way that we kind of naturally assume a fresh rookie to a sophomore year pitcher is going to progress?
Think about this. Jordan Zimmerman just 4 years ago won 19 games. All right? He comes to Detroit last year. We know how he started, how good he was, and then we know of the neck injury. It still has to be an issue. Otherwise, if not, this is perhaps the biggest waste of money in Tigers' free agent franchise history. Right now, Jordan Zimmerman has an unfathomable whip of 1.61. Right now, Jordan Zimmerman has an unfathomable ERA of 6.25. Right now, Jordan Zimmerman is allowing teams to bat .320 against him. Now, I know he's never been that strikeout pitcher, okay? But he only has 5 Ks or more twice this year. Right-handed hitters, Chad, are hitting .306 against him. Think about that. Last year, he allowed, you brought up the home runs, and I think it's a really good point. Last year, teams hit 14 bombs against him. He's allowed 11 already. This is beyond bad, and it's only been 8 starts. This is beyond bad. This is a major concern for Al Avila, and there really is no alternative. That's the problem. You have to allow him, and we'll get to the other two guys here in a minute, you have to allow him and the other two guys, Boyd and Norris, to pitch through it. Think about where this team would be without Michael Fulmer or Justin Verlander.
I think that's some of the scary part for fans, is letting everything run its course, because you're right, there's no immediate options coming up behind them, either in the farm system or perceiving the Tigers to be some kind of team that's ready to go make pounce and make a move on the market. More help is not coming, and I think that's what's so concerning to fans.
All right, then you look at Matt Boyd. Matt Boyd started the final game of the series against Texas, took the loss 2-4 now on the year. Has only pitched into the seventh inning twice, but that's even better than Daniel Norris. That's even better than Jordan Zimmerman. But Matt Boyd's not getting any better. In May, teams are batting .347 against him. In the month of May, he's got a whip of almost 2, and he's got an ERA over 7. So Matt Boyd, as much as we want I want a righty, lefty, we almost look at baseball sometimes as a starting staff similar to defense in hockey. Mike Babcock introduced that in the Olympics where he wanted a right-left combination on every single defensive pairing, right? We think in baseball, we've got to have a righty one day, a lefty the next day, a right. I could care less whether the guy throws right-handed or left-handed as long as he can gets outs. Right now, this team's got 3 right-handed starters, 2 left-handed starters, which in a perfect world is a nice balance. Not if the lefties ain't working. And Matt Boyd can't seem to find any type of rhythm whatsoever.
We used to lament the lack of balance a few years ago with this Tigers team, and now how much would anybody pay for that 2014 rotation again, or even that 2012 rotation, which was, I believe, all righties or extremely righty-heavy. You're right. It doesn't matter when the results are coming in, which side of the rubber these guys are towing. It's concerning, and we saw, if you watch the Sunday night broadcast, Sam Dyson is a relief pitcher for the Texas Rangers, and Aaron Boone was going on about how he's got a dip in his two-seam fastball. The velocity isn't where it was. The movement isn't where it was. I don't see that big velocity dip from guys like Matt Boyd. They're really young in their career. I don't think that's the type of thing that you'd expect to see, but he leaves balls up. And that ball that got served up to Mike Napoli last night was one of the furthest we've ever seen hit in Comerica Park. I think it was in the camera deck out to center field. So he's leaving off-speed pitches up. It's more than that. It's not so simple that you can diagnose it like that from a distance, just one thing. But I wonder if it's something mechanical that can be fixed by a rehab start or two.
I don't know. I don't know. But look, he doesn't bring a heavy fastball anyway. I mean, it's not like he throws in the upper 90s. All right. Now, sometimes we get lost in numbers, and because we've seen Aroldis Chapman throw over 100 miles per hour, or in the past Bruce Rondon, when he wasn't weighing over 300 pounds, throw over 100 miles per hour. We saw Jordan or Justin Verlander throw over 100 miles per hour, and we think that's what it takes to be a quality starter, and it really doesn't. Matt Boyd throwing 94 miles per hour is plenty effective. It has to have movement. You have to have good location. You have to mix your pitches, and you must command more than one pitch every single start. Matt Boyd doesn't seem to be able to command any pitches in his starts, and that's part of the problem. Daniel Norris is just as concerning. Here's a guy who's only pitched into the seventh one time. Teams are batting .300 against him. He's got a whip of 1.72 and an ERA of 4.81. That's not bad compared to the other two guys, but he's still not getting the job done. Fortunately for the Tigers, as they embark on a heavy road trip that will take them through 3 cities, 11 days, or 11 games, 10 days, they're going to go with Michael Fulmer to start against Houston, and Houston has struggled as of late, but they lead the West, for crying out loud. This team, it's a scary scenario when you're looking at it without Michael Fulmer or without Justin Verlander. It's almost as if these two guys, these two co-aces, if you will, have to be perfect every single time they take the slab. And I would guess that's difficult, really difficult for those guys in addition to their original mindset.
Absolutely, and I think part of the frustration for Tigers fans is that they have to watch teams in the other parts of the division do better in these areas. Now, bullpen is a more pronounced difference for teams like Kansas City in the past, and these past couple of years, Minnesota and obviously Cleveland. The Indians have the top save percentage in baseball. They have not blown a save yet this year. Minnesota and the White Sox are also in that top 5 save percentage. The White Sox and Minnesota are both in the top 5 among the AL for defense independent pitching percentage. The Tigers rank second to last in the AL. So does it underscore some of these frustrations when fans look over to different parts of the division? Even though no one's running away with it right now, the Tigers, I believe, are 1.5 or 2 games back. Do you think it underscores that frustration even more when you see the White Sox getting quality starts? You see Minnesota closing games out. You see the dominance of the Cleveland pitching
staff.
Well,
I think it does. We almost gave Cleveland that benefit of the doubt, but I think it does from this standpoint. Tiger fans knew the warts of their club going into the season. They knew the bullpen was still a major question mark. They knew this team wasn't great defensively, and all you got to do is watch Sunday night and see the escapades that took place in the outfield there, really all season long. And they knew this team wasn't quick. I mean, this team wasn't going to go first to third very often. They thought what it did possess is the ability to mash the baseball, and it has. It's proven that. And the ability to put out some quality starts. And you gave a good quality start statistic earlier, but that doesn't shy away from the fact that these starters, and I've said this ad nauseum since the beginning of the season, have to go longer in games. And they're not going deep in games. And that is taxing a bullpen that is already a weak part of this club. But it's one thing going long in games, and I think going 7 or into the 7th is something that every manager would like to have. And then the back end of your bullpen, Alex Wilson, Justin Wilson, whoever you may want to use that day, Shane Green, can then be effective. The problem is these guys aren't even getting to the 7th. These guys are getting through the 5th. Daniel Norris is going 4 2/3, 5 2/3 in his last couple of starts. That is not good starting pitching. And teams have got the book on Detroit. And they feel like if we can just get to the bullpen earlier in the season, that was the mindset. Granted. But guess what? That can't be the mindset anymore for them because they realize, hell, their starting pitching is just as bad as the bullpen. And that's where we stand right now with this club. I read a really interesting article over the weekend that talked about whether or not Detroit was still a contender. It brought up a number of different teams and whether they are legitimate contenders or not. And with the Tigers, they said with that makeup, and you know what the teams are or the names are. The names are Cabrera and Kinsler and Martinez and J.D. Martinez and Upton. That's what everybody, every national writer will sell a national audience on. These are the guys why we believe, in addition to Justin Verlander. What they don't bring up is the fact that there are so many unproven guys that are also in vital roles. And 2 of those vital roles are Matt Boyd and Daniel Norris. That's a serious issue, not to mention the fact that you've got a closer who's never really done it before. You've got a center field that is in constant flux. Fortunately, Alex Avila has helped stabilize some of the offense as well, because at times that's dipped. And I'm not looking for a perfect season, don't get me wrong here. And I'm not looking for all areas to be clicking at this time of the year either. But I'm really surprised at how bad the starting pitching has been for this team.
Well, you bring up a great point, and that's the roles that players are put in. And we talked a little bit in previous episodes about when the K-Rod fiasco blew up. Yeah. The role that a closer was put into, he was viewed as kind of a savior, someone to finally lock down a spot that had been an issue for the Tigers for a long time. Now we have 3 very young guys in roles in this starting pitching rotation that maybe those roles might be too big for what they're capable of performing. Now, who's that on? Is that on the management? Is that on Brad Ausmus and his staff? Is that on Rich Doobie for putting those guys in those positions and not necessarily getting out of them what was anticipated, or the way this team was built? And
well, one of those guys is Michael Fulmer, as you allude to, and Michael Fulmer's thrived in that role.
Right. So it's not fair to paint all 3 with a broad brush. Right. That's a great point by you. Fulmer does not have the same character, makeup, results, ability as Daniel Norris and as Matt Boyd. So those 3 guys were kind of penciled into that role, and obviously hindsight is 20/20. But you almost look back on it and say, well, going into this season, we knew that this was a potential Achilles heel, and now it's rearing its head pretty early into the year.
Well, and considering Jordan Zimmerman's fall off from last year,
right,
and the fact that neither one of those 2 young lefties, Boyd, Norris, were proven, why didn't we recognize it? I'll tell you why we didn't recognize it. Because we were focused on the bullpen. The bullpen has taken up so much of our air, our mindset, our discussion, and our fury that we have overlooked some of the shortcomings that the starting staff has. And look, it may turn around. I don't know. But here's what I do know. Unless they're willing to throw Shane Green into the starting lineup, he used to be a starter, but he's probably better served as a long reliever or maybe just an 8th inning guy. I think he's better out of the bullpen. And he believes he can be a starter still in this league. I like him where he's at right now. His numbers are good. His numbers are really good right now for his role. I would hate to upset that proverbial apple cart. You're right, though. There's no answer past these two guys. You're not bringing up Buck Farmer and he's becoming a savior for the Tigers because Matt Boyd is struggling. If that is the key to their success, they're in deeper trouble than most people originally thought.
And as you talked about, if you were to have a state of the Tigers before this 2017 season, you would have been out of breath and exasperated by the time you even talked about the starting pitching, because you would have complained about the station-to-station offense and how, the woes of the bullpen that have plagued this team for years.
And the defense. I mean, we saw the defense over the weekend. It was brutal, okay? And J.D. Martinez used to be a Gold Glove candidate. Tyler Collins, I've never been thrilled with his defense. He's there for offensive pop. And Justin Upton is, at best, an average left fielder. This is where they give a lot away. Look, up the middle, McCann, Avila, Kinsler, Iglesias. Pretty impressive. Everywhere else, pretty unimpressive, don't you think? Although Castellanos Sunday night made a couple of nice plays. This is interesting, though. I did see a recent promo of the greatest shortstops in the league today, okay? And they showed Carlos Correa. They showed Seager in Los Angeles. They showed Lindor in Cleveland. And I was wondering where and when they were going to get to Jose Iglesias. Did not see him in that promo. Now, it's a national promo. It's an ESPN promo. Doesn't mean that it's gospel. But I found that interesting, that maybe we overvalue his defense or his overall ability more than people do on the national scene. What do you think about that?
That's a good point. I also think he's overshadowed by a lot of superstar power in Detroit. Cabrera, Kinsler, Verlander, Upton, Martinez, and the other Martinez. A lot of superstar power there. Those other guys you mentioned, they may not be the face of the franchise, but more the faces of the franchise for their respective clubs.
That's a good point. It doesn't help to hit 200, though.
No, you're absolutely right.
See, that's the problem.
Carlos Correa can rake. Francisco Lindor can rake. Those guys will hit over 300, projecting lifetime average. Hopefully they could stick around that magical
let's face
number.
it. You and I both know, outside of catcher, everybody's looking at how good of a hitter you're going to be, right?
Right.
Not many people look defense first. They did with Ozzie Smith back in the day, but overall, most people are looking offense first. If you're batting 200, you're not even in the discussion with Bogarts and Seager, Elvis Andrus to a certain extent, even though he's not necessarily young. It's Correa, it's Lindor. There's Trey Turner, Washington. He was in that discussion. Addison Russell. Now, neither one of those guys are hitting all that well. I mean, Addison Russell's hitting like 215 for the Cubs. Trey Turner for Washington is batting 236 for the Nationals. But the bottom line is their teams, one's coming off a world championship. The other team is in first place, and they don't have, outside of Trey Turner, who's got Bryce Harper, they don't have the superstars associated with them that Jose Iglesias does.
Right. In baseball, if you can hit, they'll find a spot for you. And if you can't, you're bumming.
Yeah, no doubt.
Doesn't matter how good your defense is, your speed is. If Billy Hamilton had an OBP above 276 or whatever it is, then he might find a spot or be a more clamored for player, but that's not the case.
Let's shift gears a little bit, if we can. Let's hit the football aspect with Calvin Johnson. Calvin Johnson is, I think, the greatest receiver the Lions have ever had. I think he's headed to the Hall of Fame. It may not be on the first ballot, but I do think he's headed to the Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. He's also gone through after reading the article printed by Dave Burkett of the Detroit Free Press. He's also in a situation where it looks like it's a little acrimonious between him and the Detroit Lions. Because, Calvin Johnson had a signing bonus, and there was still, at the time of his retirement, he was still owed $320,000 of that signing bonus, or in the NFL, you give that back a lot of times. Repay the final portion of a signing bonus that he signed in 2012. In 2012, it was worth $3.2 million, but because he retired early, the Lions asked for it back. How big of an issue is this for Calvin Johnson, but maybe more importantly, the perception of the Detroit Lions? Personally, I don't think it's a huge deal, and I'll tell you why in a moment. First, I want your thoughts.
Well, I want your idea on the perception issue, because fans have liked to blame this organization for a lot of different things for a long period of time. Some of them warranted, some of them a little bit less warranted. I was trying to get a gauge for common practice in the NFL. It's hard to find a really long pattern here. Seattle did not force Marshawn Lynch to repay his signing bonus. Tony Romo was not forced to repay his signing bonus by
Those
Dallas.
are the two common examples recently.
Yeah, under slightly different circumstances. more low-profile players, but the San Francisco 49ers did ask for those bonuses back from Chris Borland when he retired early, the former linebacker out of Wisconsin, and Anthony Davis, their former left tackle. It's difficult to kind of set a precedent. So from the Lions fans' perspective, you look at the organization, you say, this is a chance to win some goodwill for a team that is constantly embattled within its own city. Bob Quinn was in his first year as GM. It's difficult to inherit somebody else's problems and manage them effectively and well. But this is an area that I don't know Bob Quinn necessarily handled all that well. Maybe they were holding the door open for some kind of return for Calvin Johnson that you and I weren't aware of, some kind of discussion. But Calvin Johnson seems to be shutting that idea down. He doesn't seem keen to return, nor does he seem like he was close in those discussions to return. So maybe Bob Quinn was holding off for that. But in my mind, from a distance, it appears this guy hasn't really been celebrated appropriately by the franchise. Does that play into negotiations?
How so? But how so, though? I mean, look, he became the highest paid receiver in the history of the game when the Lions originally
since his
signed
retirement.
Okay.
I mean, since his retirement.
What would you like to have seen them do?
Acknowledgement before a game. There's some kind of ceremony. I'm wary of giving players too much power. Otherwise, you end up with a situation like Eric Dickerson and the Chargers, where it seems like every external move that they make has to be blessed by him. Otherwise, it'll divide the fan base.
The Rams, you
right?
mean.
So,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, the Rams.
Now moving to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So
I'm not saying Calvin Johnson needs to be in the draft room, but provide an opportunity, a venue, an event, a chance for the Detroit fans to give back and say thank you to Calvin Johnson. I don't know that space was created anywhere except for on social media.
That's interesting, because what's the time limit on that? Why does that have to be right away? Who says they're not going to do that? I mean, eventually they will, right?
You're right. It's early to close the book on that, and that's why I said maybe there's discussions with Bob Quinn about some kind of return that was early in his tenure that we didn't have. But you also think about Bob Quinn, kind of the plane lands and he's running from jump when he actually got this job in Detroit. The first thing he wants to handle is not, the greatest player in recent memory and one of the greatest players in NFL history, trying to make a decision like that on how the guy's career is going to be preserved. In terms of the actual dollar amount,
let's just remind people he made $114 million when he played with the Lions.
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely, over 9 seasons,
and he gave them everything he possibly could. He was a hell of a professional. He did just about anything the organization asked him to do. He's truly one of the good guys this sports landscape in Detroit has ever had. But the perception, you hit it right on the nose. The perception is that the Lions have always been cheap. It goes way back to Russ Thomas when he was the general manager and the way he negotiated deals with athletes. Chuck Schmidt, who then replaced him as the general manager. Matt Millen, when he came in and took away Christmas bonuses from a lot of the secretaries and personnel in the front office and things like that. So they view that, they associate that with cheapness.
And let's not forget this stipend or this opportunity to pay back a signing bonus through the CBA is loosely referred to as the Barry Sanders rule.
Right. Okay. So there you go. But here's what I would tell you. Let's remind people of the stadium that they've built or helped build, because some of that with taxpayers' money as well. The making Calvin Johnson that highest paid player. Golden Tate at the time signed a contract that everybody thought was absolutely ridiculous. Most recently, the contract signed by Ricky Wagner, highest paid right tackle, outside Lane Johnson, who's going to be moved to left tackle. The guaranteed cost that it's going to take to keep and sign and then hold on to TJ Lang. And eventually, Matt Stafford is going to be the highest paid player in the NFL. Ziggy Ansah is going to be handsomely paid. It's not like this team has gone about its business rubbing pennies together and telling people you're going to have to buy your own Gatorade, all right?
And it's not like at each one of those moves, Bob Quinn is saying, are people going to think we're cheap if we do or don't spend this money? He's making each of those decisions in a vacuum, isolated decisions, and each one you adjust accordingly and you handle on its own.
Yeah. I don't think this affects the Lions long term. And here's why. And I don't think it affects Calvin Johnson long term. You brought up Barry Sanders earlier, and it's a great example. Because Barry Sanders supposedly left on bad terms with the Lions, and now he is celebrated yearly, very often. When I bring up certain names, do you think it leaves a bad taste in people's mouths when Joe Montana goes back to San Francisco? Absolutely not. Final game at Candlestick Park, he was front and center. He's still beloved. He didn't finish his career with the San Francisco 49ers. Akeem Olajuwon, you know where he finished his career? With the Toronto Raptors. Okay? People think of Willie Mays. Do they think of him as a Met or a Giant? I know those are kind of different scenarios because of, they chose to leave. Calvin Johnson stayed his time with one team in his career. But the bottom line is people thought when Franco Harris left Pittsburgh that his reputation in Pittsburgh was going to be tainted. He finished his career with the Seattle Seahawks, or Michael Jordan with the Washington Wizards, or Ray Bork chasing a ring in Colorado, Karl Malone doing the same with the Lakers. They're still celebrated in those towns. Calvin Johnson will still be celebrated, and celebrated appropriately. So I just think everything's going to be fine. It's just the here and now. People like to talk about it, right?
That's a good point. And I don't know the relationship, just to borrow one of your analogies, of Joe Montana and the San Francisco 49ers, but you ask yourself, if they go have a Ring of Honor ceremony in San Francisco or something to that equivalent, and they invite some of their greats back, Joe Montana's back to help celebrate that with his former teammates. If he secretly harbors some resentment towards that organization, first of all, it's kind of trivial for him to carry that out towards their current GM ownership system, unless it's the same people. That's a little petty on his own part. Second of all, if he harbors that resentment, do fans really care if he's back there clapping along, taking the mic, wishing them well and everything like that? Is perception and reality, do they need to match? Or can there be a bit of a chip on their shoulder and you can still play nice for the crowds and for the TV cameras and everything be okay? I suppose that's a question for each individual player if they can stomach that. But I think you could have some cases like that out there too.
The Lions annually have, their alumni come back. Calvin Johnson will be part of that celebration. He may not originally go, but deep down inside, eventually, I think he will go. And this is some negative pub for this franchise to start, but I think that's because it's oftentimes linked to what has taken place in the past. You mentioned the Barry Sanders situation, and I think it's a good one. Detroit arguably has had two of the greatest players of their generation at their respective positions, and people feel like they left on bad terms. And I think this is going to blow over, and I think, how about this? How about Brett Favre? How bad was the relationship with him and the Packers? And yet they come back, they retire the jersey, he gets a standing ovation, he talks in front of everybody at Lambeau Field, and all seems to have forgiven, right? It's the same thing, I think, with Calvin Johnson in this case.
That's a great point. And a lot of it is the character of the individual. You know what I mean? And I don't mean to bad talk Barry Sanders in any way, shape, or form. I don't know him as a human being, but I have met Calvin Johnson before, and I've heard multiple stories about both he and his father. They seem like the kind of people that wouldn't kind of harbor any sort of resentment over this in the long term. And that might be presumptuous on my part, but you're right. I don't see in the long term him holding this as some kind of grudge into the real distant future. One other point we could talk about is the actual dollar amount that Calvin Johnson is returning. It's only 10% of his signing bonus. The team could have recouped a larger amount, from my understanding, but when he originally renegotiated his contract back in 2015 to lower the cap hit, that might be something that they took into consideration.
But I don't think that's the point. The point is they're asking for money back in the first place because they feel like Calvin Johnson gave them everything they possibly could. Fans only care about the product on the field. They don't care how much it costs to put water and Gatorade in all the coolers. They don't care how much it costs to put ice in the cold tubs. They don't care how much it costs to pay the electricity bill or the water bill at Allen Park or anything else. They care about the players on the field. They want to be viewed, players to view their city, their town, their organization as a class organization and one that should be envied of everybody else. Okay, I mean that's the kind of thing that I get from Pittsburgh. I was in Latrobe last year for the Lions and Steelers. They had dual practices, and I was talking with Kevin Colbert, who's the general manager of the Steelers, and they talked about all the different players who come back and what they say about their experience with the Steelers. And I'm thinking, that's great. And I respect the hell out of that. I really do. But there are some players who left there on bad terms. Santonio Holmes, for example. Originally, James Harrison, right? It wasn't a rosy departing of the two sides by any stretch. So it's about winning, and it's about how that player performs in fans' eyes. And they feel like and rightfully so, Calvin Johnson has been the best receiver they've ever seen. That he's played through injury, even though at times they've called and bitched about him not being able to play because he's injured so often. They've seen what he's done in the community. What they fail to recognize is, because of all that, he was paid handsomely. That the Lions did step forward and say, you deserve to be the highest paid wide receiver. There are a lot of fans out there, Chad, who said originally, I wouldn't give him the money. He doesn't deserve the money. It's too much for that position because he's only catching 80 to 90 passes a year. He's not making as big a difference as we feel like he should. At the time, that's what they're saying. And now that this comes out, the problem is more with the organization than it is with the player himself.
So as part of the problem then, taking that line of logic that you talked about with a Pittsburgh or somebody like that the Lions don't have this long track record of guys who stay with them for their full career, have a healthy, celebrated career that's actually successful on the field. Jeff Beck has played at a Pro Bowl level for a couple of years. I know he's been a bit of a dog in Detroit at times, but played at a Pro Bowl level for a couple of years, held down a very difficult position for a long time for the Lions, and he may not have been the best pro in the league at his spot the entire time he was here, but he was more than reliable for a long time. If he played for other organizations, you can argue that he would be celebrated in a different way.
Yeah.
The list only begins there. It doesn't end there with Jeff Backus. But the Lions don't have this long track record of players that have ridden off into the sunset wearing Honolulu blue and silver. And maybe that's part of the perception. Fans are clamoring for these only two guys that are on this great pedestal, and Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson. Neither of them have been treated properly in the minds of some of the fans. And their fear is that Calvin is going to be Barry 2.0. And I think your point about other organizations having a longer track record of that's something that the Lions can benefit from. Is start to build that good PR, and down the line you're talking about.
What do you mean the good PR? What does the good PR do for them?
I'm saying Lions fans don't have memories of players with jerseys being hoisted to the rafters and division titles being won and things like that.
Because they don't do that, though. The Lions don't do that. They don't. First of all, obviously division titles, you're right. But retiring jerseys, they do have a number of jerseys that are out of circulation, if you will, 20 with Sanders, Sims, and Lombardi and the like. But I don't know how that creates goodwill.
Because these other organizations, the organizations have always been bigger than any of the individual players, and that's what's kind of underscored is their servitude to the organization, I think, when their career ends. And to a degree, Calvin Johnson becomes bigger than the Lions a little bit. Barry Sanders becomes bigger than the Lions for a certain stretch. Yeah. Fans' loyalty to that player is greater than their loyalty to the franchise, and that's why the team can't get away with any sort of perceived transgression in the way they treat them on their way out the door.
To a certain extent, you look at the Pistons, I mean, their players became bigger than the organization, and too many of the players became bigger than the organization. That never happened with the Red Wings. Did it happen with Yzerman? Did it happen with Lidstrom, where they became bigger than the franchise? Maybe it did, because more people want Steve Yzerman as the general manager than anything else right now with that franchise. The Lions haven't had the success. That's the bottom line. The reason they're gravitating more toward the player than the franchise is because the franchise hasn't won.
And that's why, as much as we don't want to make decisions based on the way fans feel about certain things, public relations does play into this. And my question is the juice worth the squeeze for the Lions? You gained $320,000 in cap space. Is that worth the perceived misdoing that you're doing to your greatest player in recent memory?
Do you think Bob Quinn should be thinking about that? Should Bob Quinn be sitting in his office going, man, I'm worried about what fans are going to say because I'm asking for $320,000 back from Calvin Johnson even though we're owed it?
I don't think he should base every decision based on that, but when the dollar amount is that insignificant, and if we're to believe Darren Ravel, who says each NFL franchise makes $685,000 a day in revenue sharing, so they make more than twice what they're asking back from Calvin Johnson every 24 hours passing of the clock. Yeah. And that's where I say, is the juice worth the squeeze? No, he shouldn't make a PR decision for every football move. But A, this is barely a football move when you're talking about $300,000 worth of cap space.
Right.
And B, the public perception is important here. When you're talking about the greatest player in recent franchise memory, maybe the greatest in franchise history.